The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1, Continued, Cassette 11, Side 1. He called in question one after another of the Christian usages of his time: indulgences, fasting, pilgrimages, auricular confession, monasticism, clerical celibacy, relic worship, prayers to the saints, the burning of heretics. He gave allegorical or rational explanations of many biblical passages. He compared the story of Adam and Eve with that of Prometheus, and advised the least literal interpretation of the Scriptures. He resolved the pains of hell into the perpetual anguish of mind that accompanies habitual sin. He did not broadcast his doubts among the people, for he had no comforting or deterrent myths to offer in place of the old ones. Piety, he wrote, requires that we should sometimes conceal truth, that we should take care not to show it always, as if it did not matter when, where, or to whom we show it. Perhaps we must admit with Plato that lies are useful to the people. Despite this strong bent toward rationalism, Erasmus remained externally orthodox. He never lost his affection for Christ, for the Gospels, and for the symbolic ceremonies with which the Church promoted piety. He made a character in the colloquies say, "If anything is in common use with Christians that is not repugnant to the Holy Scriptures, I observe it for this reason, that I may not offend other people." He dreamed of replacing theology with the philosophy of Christ, and strove to harmonize this with the thought of the greater pagans. He applied to Plato, Cicero, and Seneca the phrase divinely inspired. He would not admit that such men were excluded from salvation, and he could scarce forbear praying to Saint Socrates. He asked the Church to reduce the essential dogmas of Christianity to as few as possible, leaving opinion free on the rest. He did not advocate the full tolerance of all opinions, who does, but he favored a lenient attitude toward religious heresy. His ideal of religion was the imitation of Christ. We must admit, however, that his own practice was less than evangelical. 6. The Man. How actually did he live? At this time, in 1517, he resided for the most part in Flanders, at Brussels, Antwerp, and Louvain. He dwelt in celibate privacy with one servant, but often accepted the hospitality of the prosperous, who courted his company as a social distinction and an intellectual feast. His tastes were fastidious. His nerves and feelings were refined to the point of frequent suffering from the vigorous vulgarities of life. He drank wine abundantly and prided himself on his ability to carry it steadily. It may have been part cause of the gout and stones that galled him, but he thought it relieved his pain by dilating his arteries. In 1514, aged 45 or 48, he described himself as a gray-headed individual who must drink nothing but wine and must be nice in what he eats. Fasting disagreed with him, and he fumed against fish. Perhaps his bile colored his theology. He slept poorly, like most people whose busy brains recognize no curfew. He consoled himself with friends and books. "I seem deprived of myself when I am shut out from my usual habits of study. My home is where I have my library." It was partly to buy books that he solicited money with all the assiduity of a parish priest. He received regular pensions from Mountjoy and Warham, substantial gifts like the 300 florins, or about $7,500, from Jean le Sauvage, Chancellor of Burgundy, and royalties exceeding those earned by any other author of his time. He disclaimed any love of money. He sought it because, as a man without moorings, he feared the insecurity of a lonely old age. Meanwhile, he continued to refuse lucrative posts that would have extended his income at the cost of his freedom. His appearance was at first unimpressive. He was short, thin, pale, weak in voice and constitution. He impressed by his sensitive hands, his long, sharp nose, his blue-gray eyes flashing with wit, and his speech, the conversation of the richest and quickest mind of that brilliant age. The greatest artists among his northern contemporaries were eager to paint his portrait, and he consented to sit for them because such portraits were welcomed as gifts by his friends. Quentin Massys pictured him in 1517, absorbed in writing, bundled in a heavy coat as protection against the chilly rooms of those centuries. This was presented to Moore. Dürer made a charcoal drawing of Erasmus in 1520, and a remarkable engraving in 1526. Here the German touch gave the good European a thoroughly Dutch physiognomy. "If I look like that," said the sitter, "I am a great knave." Holbein surpassed all these efforts in the many portraits that he made of Erasmus. One is in Turin, another in England, a third in Basel, the best in the Louvre, all masterly performances by the greatest portrait painter in the north. Here the scholar has become a philosopher, quiet, meditative, somewhat melancholy, reluctantly resigned to the careless neutrality of nature and the mortality of genius. "What our lot brings must be borne," he wrote in 1517, "and I have composed my mind for every event." A stoic ataraxia that he never really achieved. "He loves glory," he said of an ambitious youth, "but he does not know what a weight glory is." Yet Erasmus, like many a noble soul, labored night and day to win that incubus. His faults leaped to the eye. His virtues were secrets known only to his intimates. He could beg shamelessly, but he could also give, and many a rising spirit expanded in the warmth of his praise. When Reuchlin was assailed by Peppercorn, Erasmus wrote to his friends among the cardinals at Rome and helped to win protection for the harassed Hebraist. He lacked modesty and gratitude, which came hard to one courted by popes and kings. He was impatient and resentful of criticism, and sometimes answered it in the abusive manner of that polemic age. He shared the anti-Semitism of even the scholars of the Renaissance. His interests were as narrow as they were intense. He loved literature when it clothed philosophy, and philosophy when it left logic for life, but he almost ignored science, scenery, music, and art. He smiled at the systems of astronomy that then strutted the stage, and the stars smiled with him. In all his multitudinous correspondence, there is no appreciation of the Alps or the architecture of Oxford and Cambridge. Nationalism a curse to humanity, and challenged statesmen to forge a universal state. Second, when Erasmus was in Rome in 1509. And the lusty singing of the Reformed congregations would later offend his educated ears. His sense of humor was usually subtle and refined, occasionally Rabelaisian, often sarcastic, once inhuman, as when he wrote to a friend on hearing that some heretics had been burned, "I would pity them the less if they raised the price of fuel now that winter is coming on." He had not only the natural egoism or selfishness of all men, but also that secret and cherished egotism or self-conceit without which the writer or artist would be crushed in the ruthless rush of an indifferent world. He loved flattery and agreed with it despite frequent disclaimers. "Good judges," he told a friend, "say that I write better than any other man living." It was true, though only in Latin. He wrote bad French, spoke a little Dutch and English, tasted Hebrew only with the tip of the tongue, and knew Greek imperfectly, but he mastered Latin thoroughly and handled it as a living tongue applicable to the most un-Latin nuances and trivia of his time. A century newly enamored of the classics forgave most of his faults for the lively brilliance of his style, the novel charm of his understatements, the bright dagger of his irony. His letters rival Cicero's in elegance and urbanity, surpassed them in vivacity and wit. Moreover, his Latin was his own, not imitatively Ciceronian. It was a living, forceful, flexible speech, not an echo 1,500 years old. His letters, like Petrarch's, were coveted by scholars and princes only next to the stimulus of his conversation. He tells us, perhaps with some literary license, that he received 20 letters a day and wrote 40. Several volumes of them were published in his lifetime, carefully edited by their authors, so conscious of posterity. Leo X, Adrian VI, Queen Marguerite of Navarre, King Sigismund I of Poland, Henry VIII, More, Collett, Pirkheimer were among his correspondents. The modest More wrote, "I cannot get rid of a prurient feeling of vanity when it occurs to my mind that I shall be commended to a distant posterity by the friendship of Erasmus." No other contemporary writer equaled his fame, unless we think of Luther as a writer. One Oxford bookseller reported in 1520 that a third of all his sales were of works by Erasmus. He had many enemies, especially among the theologians of Louvain, but he had disciples in a dozen universities, and humanists throughout Europe hailed him as their exemplar in chief. In the field of literature he was the Renaissance and Humanism embodied, their cult of the classics and the polished Latin style, their gentleman's agreement not to break with the Church, and not to disturb the inevitable mythology of the masses, provided the Church winked at the intellectual freedom of the educated classes and permitted an orderly internal reform of ecclesiastical abuses and absurdities. Erasmus, like all humanists, was heartened by the elevation of Leo X to the papacy. Their dream had come true. A humanist, a scholar, and a gentleman, the living unification of the Renaissance and Christianity, had mounted the greatest of thrones. Surely now a peaceful cleansing of the Church would come. Education would spread. The people would keep their lovely ritual and consolatory faith, but the human mind would be free. Almost at the brink of Luther, Erasmus kept that hope, but on September 9, 1517, he wrote from Antwerp to Thomas, Cardinal of York, an ominous line. "In this part of the world, I'm afraid a great revolution is impending." In less than 2 months it came. Chapter 15. Germany on the Eve of Luther, 1453 to 1517. 1. The Age of the Fuggers. In the final half-century before the Reformation, all classes in Germany prospered except the knights. Probably it was the rising status of the peasants that sharpened their resentment against surviving disabilities. A few were bondsmen, a minority were proprietors, the great majority were tenant farmers paying rent to feudal lords in produce, services, or money. The tenants complained of the lord's exactions. Of the 12, in some cases 60 days of labor which custom required them to give him yearly, of his withdrawal of land from the Allgemeine, or commons, in which tradition had allowed them to fish, cut timber, and pasture their animals, of the damage done to crops by the lord's huntsmen and hounds, of biased administration of justice in the local courts which the landlords controlled, and of the death tax laid upon the tenant family when the passing of its head interrupted the care of the land. Peasant proprietors raged at the usurious rates they had to pay for loans to move their crops, and at the quick foreclosure of farms by clever money-lenders who had made loans to owners obviously unable to repay. All classes of tillers grudged the annual tithe levied by the Church on their harvests and broods. These discontents ignited agrarian revolts sporadically throughout the 15th century. In 1431, the peasants around Worms rose in futile rebellion. They chose as their standard a farmer's shoe, actually a boot laced from ankle to knee. They stuck it on poles or painted its likeness on flags. And Bundschuh, the bond of the shoe, became the favorite title of rebel rural bands in the age of Luther. In 1476, a cowherd, Hans Böhm, announced that the Mother of God had revealed to him that the kingdom of heaven on earth was at hand. There should be no more emperors, popes, princes, or feudal lords. All men were to be brothers, all women sisters. All were to share alike in the fruits of the earth. Lands, woods, waters, pastures were to be common and free. Thousands of peasants came to hear Hans. A priest joined him. The Bishop of Würzburg smiled tolerantly. But when Hans told his followers to bring to the next meeting all the weapons they could muster, the bishop had him arrested. The bishop's soldiers fired into the crowd that tried to save him, and the movement collapsed. In 1491, the peasants on the domain of the abbot of Kempten in Alsace attacked his monastery, alleging that they were being forced into serfdom by forged documents. The Emperor Frederick III effected a compromise. 2 years later, the feudatories of the Bishop of Strasbourg proclaimed a Bundschuh. They demanded an end to feudal dues and ecclesiastical tithes, the abolition of all debts, and the death of all Jews. They planned to seize the town of Schlettstadt, whence they hoped to spread their power through Alsace. The authorities got wind of the plot, seized the leaders, tortured and hanged them, and frightened the rest into temporary submission. In 1502, the peasants of the Bishop of Speyer formed a Bundschuh of 7,000 men, pledged to end feudalism, to hunt out and kill all priests and monks, and to restore what they believed to have been the communism of their ancestors. A peasant revealed the scheme in the confessional. Ecclesiastics and nobles joined in circumventing it. The main conspirators were tortured and hanged. In 1512, Jos Fritz secretly organized a similar movement near Freiburg im Breisgau. God, the Pope, and the Emperor were to be spared, but all feudal ownership and dues were to be abolished. A peasant who had been constrained to join this Bund exposed it to his confessor. The authorities arrested and tortured the leaders. The revolt aborted, but Jos Fritz lived to join in the peasants' revolt of 1525. In 1517, a league of 90,000 peasants in Styria and Carinthia undertook to end feudalism there. For 3 months their bands attacked castles and slew lords. Finally, Emperor Maximilian, who sympathized with their cause but rebuked their violence, sent against them a small force of soldiery, which subdued them into sullen peace. But the stage was set for the Peasants' War and the Anabaptist communism of Reformation Germany. Meanwhile, a more matter-of-fact revolution was proceeding in German industry and commerce. Most industry was still handicraft, but it was increasingly controlled by entrepreneurs who provided material and capital and bought and sold the finished product. The mining industry was making rapid progress. Great profits were drawn from mining silver, copper, and gold. Gold and silver bullion now became a favorite means of storing wealth. And the royalties paid for mining rights to territorial princes, especially to the Elector of Saxony, who protected Luther, enabled some of them to resist both Pope and Emperor. Reliable silver coins were minted, currency multiplied, the passage to a money economy was almost complete. Silver plate became a common possession in the middle and upper classes. Some families displayed tables or chairs of solid silver. Monstrances, chalices, reliquaries, even statues of silver or gold accumulated in the German churches, and inclined princes to a religious reform that allowed them to confiscate ecclesiastical wealth. Aeneas Sylvius, in 1458, marveled to see German innkeepers regularly serving drinks in silver cups, and asked, "What woman, not only among the nobility but among the plebeians, does not glitter with gold? And shall I make mention of horse bridles embossed with the purest gold, of armor and helmets sparkling with gold?" The financiers were now a major political power. The Jewish moneylenders of Germany were displaced by the Christian family firms of the Welsers, the Hochstädters, and the Fuggers, all of Augsburg, which, at the end of the 15th century, was the financial capital of Christendom. Johannes Fugger, a weaver's son, became a textile merchant and left at his death in 1409 a small fortune of 3,000 florins, or about $75,000. His son Jakob expanded the business. When he died in 1469, his wealth ranked 7th in Augsburg. Jakob's sons Ulrich, Georg, and Jakob II raised the firm to supremacy by advancing money to the princes of Germany, Austria, and Hungary in return for the revenue of mines, lands, or cities. From these speculative investments, the Fuggers derived immense profits, so that by 1500 they were the richest family in Europe. Jakob II was the culminating genius of the family, enterprising, ruthless, and industrious. He trained himself stoically by studying every phase of the business, every advance in bookkeeping, manufacturing, merchandising, and finance. He demanded the sacrifice of everything but the family itself to the business, and the subordination of every individual Fugger to the family interest. He established the principle that none but a Fugger should have power in the concern, and he never allowed his political friendships to influence his loans. He formed cartels with other firms to control the price and sale of various products. So in 1498 he and his brothers entered into an agreement with Augsburg merchants to corner the Venetian market in copper and uphold the price. In 1488 the family lent 150,000 florins to Archduke Sigismund of Austria, and as security it received the entire yield of the Schwarz silver mines until the debt should be repaid. In 1492 the Fuggers intermarried with the Turzos of Krakow in a cartel to work the silver and copper mines of Hungary, and to maintain the highest possible prices for the products. By 1501, the Fuggers were operating vast mining enterprises in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and Spain. In addition, they imported and manufactured textiles. They traded in silks, velvets, furs, spices, citrus fruits, munitions, jewelry. They organized express transportation and a private postal service. By 1511, when Jakob II became sole head of the firm, its assets reached 196,791 guilders. By 1527, 2 years after his death, its capital was reckoned at 2,021,202 guilders, or about $50 million. a profit of 50% per year through 16 years. Part of this profit came from the Fuggers' relations with emperors and popes. Ulrich Fugger made loans to Frederick III. Jakob II became chief broker to Maximilian I and Charles V. The vast extension of the Habsburg power in the 16th century was made possible by Fugger loans. Though Jakob rejected the ecclesiastical limitations on interest and the attempts of churchmen to fix a just price for consumers' goods, he remained a Catholic, made loans to clergymen to pay for their promotion fees, and with Ulrich obtained in 1494 the management of papal finances in Germany, Scandinavia, Bohemia, and Hungary. In his final years, Jakob Fugger was the most honored and unpopular citizen in Germany. Some Catholics attacked him as a usurer, some nobles for outbribing them in the pursuit of office or power, some merchants for his enviable monopolies, many workers for overriding medieval regulations of trade and finance, most Protestants for managing the export of German money to the popes. But emperors and kings, princes and prelates sent envoys to him as to a ruler. Dürer, Burkmeyer, and the elder Holbein painted his portrait as a stern and simple realist, and Maximilian gave him the title of Count of the Empire. Jakob tried to atone for his wealth by building 106 houses for the poor but Catholic of Augsburg. For his bones he raised a pretty chapel in the church of St. Anna. He died in the odor of sanctity, leaving millions of guilders and no children. The greatest gift of all had been denied him. From him we may date the capitalist era in Germany, the growth of private monopolies, the dominance of businessmen controlling money over feudal lords owning land. German mining and textiles were already organized on capitalist lines, that is, controlled by providers of capital, by the end of the 15th century, following the lead of Flanders and Italy in textiles 100 years before. The Middle Ages had thought of private property as in some measure a public trust. The rights of the owner were limited by the necessities of the group whose organization gave him opportunities, facilities, and protection. Perhaps under the influence of Roman law, which now overshadowed German jurisprudence, the property owner began to think of his ownership as absolute. He felt that he had a right to do what he liked with his own. It did not seem wrong to the Fuggers, the Hochstädters, and other merchant princes to corner a product and then force up its price, or to form cartels for the limitation of output and the control of trade, or to manipulate investments so as to cheat small stockholders. In many instances, a merchant placed his agents at the city gates with orders to buy for him all specified incoming goods so that he might resell them at his own price in the town. Ambrose Hochstädter bought up all available quicksilver, then raised the retail price 75%. A German company bought 600,000 guilders worth of pepper from the King of Portugal at higher than the usual price, on condition that the king would charge a still higher price to all other importers of pepper from Portugal into Germany. Partly through such agreements and monopolies, partly through growing wealth and an increase in the demand for goods, partly through a rising supply of precious metals from Central Europe and America, prices mounted between 1480 and 1520 with a celerity rivaled only in our century. In a short time, because of usury and avarice, Luther complained, he that could formerly live on 100 guilders cannot do so now on 200. It is more than a twice-told tale. The Middle Ages had seen great inequalities of political power. The new age of the Fuggers added such economic disparities as Europe had not known since the millionaires and slaves of imperial Rome. Some merchant capitalists of Augsburg or Nuremberg were worth 5 million francs each, or about $25 million. Many bought their way into the landed aristocracy, sported coats of arms, and repaid high-born contempt with conspicuous consumption. Joachim Hochstädter and Franz Baumgartner spent 5,000 florins, or about $125,000, on a single banquet, or gambled with 10,000 florins in one game. The luxuriously furnished and artistically decorated homes of rich businessmen aroused the resentment of nobility, clergy, and proletariat alike. Preachers, writers, revolutionaries, and legislators joined in fulminating against monopolists. Geiler von Kaisersberg demanded that they should be driven out like wolves, since they fear neither God nor man and breed famine, thirst, and poverty. Ulrich von Hutten distinguished 4 classes of robbers: merchants, jurists, priests, and knights, and judged the merchants to be the greatest robbers of them all. The Cologne Reichstag of 1512 called upon all civic authorities to proceed with diligence and severity against the usurious, forestalling capitalistic companies. Such decrees were repeated by other diets, but to no effect. Some legislators themselves had investments in the great merchant firms, agents of the law were pacified with shares of stock, and many cities prospered from the growth of unimpeded trade. Strasbourg, Colmar, Metz, Augsburg, Nuremberg, Ulm, Vienna, Ratisbon, or Regensburg, Mainz, Speyer, Worms, Cologne, Trier, Bremen, Dortmund, Hamburg, Magdeburg, Lübeck, Breslau were thriving hubs of industry, commerce, letters, and arts. They and 77 others were free cities. That is, they made their own laws, sent representatives to the provincial and imperial diets, and acknowledged no political obedience except to the emperor, who was too indebted to them for financial or military aid to attack their liberties. Though these cities were ruled by guilds dominated by businessmen, nearly every one of them was a paternalistic welfare state to the extent that it regulated production and distribution, wages and prices and the quality of goods, with a view to protecting the weak from the strong and to ensure the necessaries of life to all. We should now call them towns rather than cities, since none of them exceeded 52,000 population. Nevertheless, they were as populous as at any time before the middle of the 19th century, and more prosperous than at any time before Goethe. Aeneas Sylvius, a proud Italian, wrote of them enthusiastically in 1458. Never has Germany been richer, more resplendent than today. Without exaggeration, it may be said that no country in Europe has better or more beautiful cities. They look as fresh and new as if they had been built yesterday, and in no other cities is so much freedom to be found. Nothing more magnificent can be found in all Europe than Cologne, with its wonderful churches, city hall, towers and palaces, its dignified burghers, its noble streams, its fertile cornfields. Nor is Augsburg surpassed in wealth by any city in the world. Vienna has palaces and churches that even Italy may envy. Augsburg was not only the financial center of Germany, it was the main commercial link with then-flourishing Italy. It was chiefly Augsburg merchants who built and managed that Fondaco Tedesco in Venice, whose walls were frescoed by Giorgione and Titian. So bound to Italy, Augsburg echoed the Italian Renaissance. Its merchants supported scholars and artists. Some of its capitalists became models of manners and culture, if not of morals. So Konrad Peutinger, syndic or mayor in 1493, was diplomat, merchant, scholar, jurist, Latinist, Hellenist, and antiquarian, as well as businessman. Nuremberg was a center of arts and crafts, rather than of large-scale industry or finance. Its streets were still medievally tortuous, and shaded by overhanging upper stories or balconies. Its red-tiled roofs, high-peaked gables, and oriel windows made a picturesque confusion against its rural background and the Pegnitz's turgid stream. The people were not as affluent here as in Augsburg, but they were joyous, gemütlich, and loved to disport themselves in such festivities as their annual carnival of mask, costume, and dance. Here Hans Sachs and the Meistersingers sang their lusty airs. Here Albrecht Dürer raised German painting and engraving to their zenith. Here the best goldsmiths and silversmiths north of the Alps made costly vases, church vessels, statuettes. Here the metalworkers fashioned 1,000 plant, animal, and human forms in bronze, or wrought iron into handsome railings or screens. Here the woodcutters were so numerous that we wonder how they could all make a living. The churches of the cities became repositories and museums of art, for every guild or corporation or prosperous family commissioned some work of beauty for the shrine of a patron saint. Regiomontanus chose Nuremberg as his home because I find there without difficulty all the peculiar instruments necessary for astronomy. And there it is easiest for me to keep in touch with the learned of all countries, for Nuremberg, thanks to the perpetual journeyings of her merchants, may be counted the center of Europe. It was characteristic of Nuremberg that the most famous of her merchants, Willibald Pirkheimer, was also an enthusiastic humanist, a patron of the arts, and a devoted friend of Dürer's. Erasmus called Pirkheimer the chief glory of Germany. The voyages of da Gama and Columbus, the Turkish control of the Aegean, and Maximilian's wars with Venice disturbed the trade between Germany and Italy. More and more German exports and imports moved along the great rivers to the North Sea, the Baltic, and the Atlantic. Wealth and power passed from Augsburg and Nuremberg to Cologne, Hamburg, Bremen, and above all, Antwerp. The Fuggers and Welsers furthered this trend by making Antwerp a chief center of their operations. The northward movement of German money and trade divorced northern Germany from the Italian economy and made it strong enough to protect Luther from emperor and pope. South Germany, perhaps for opposite reasons, remained Catholic. 2. The state. How was Germany governed in this critical and formative age? The knights or lower nobility, who in former years had ruled the countryside as vassals of feudal seigneurs, were losing their military, economic, and political position. Mercenary troops hired by princes or cities and equipped with firearms and artillery were mowing down knightly cavalry helplessly brandishing swords. Commercial wealth was raising prices and costs, and was outstripping landed property as a source of power. Cities were establishing their independence, and princes were centralizing authority and law. The knights took some revenge by waylaying the commerce that passed their way, and when merchants and municipalities protested, the knights asserted their right to wage private wars. Comines described the Germany of this time as prickly with castles, from which at any time robber barons and their armed retainers might pour forth to plunder merchant, traveler, and peasant alike. Some knights made it their custom to cut off the right hands of the merchants they robbed. Goetz von Berlichingen, although he himself had lost his right hand in the service of his prince, substituted an iron hand and led knightly bands to attack not only merchants but cities, Nuremberg, Darmstadt, Metz, and Mainz in 1512. His friend, Franz von Sickingen, laid claims against the city of Worms, ravaged its environs, seized its councillors, tortured its burgomaster, resisted all attempts of imperial troops to capture him, and was transiently subdued only by receiving an annual subsidy to serve the emperor. 22 cities of Swabia, chiefly Augsburg, Ulm, Freiburg, and Constance, joined with some of the higher nobility to reform the Swabian League in 1488. These and other combinations checked the robber knights and succeeded in having private war declared illegal. But Germany on the eve of Luther was a scene of social and political disorder, a universal reign of force. The secular and ecclesiastical princes who presided over the chaos contributed to it by their venality, their diverse coinages and customs dues, their confused competition for wealth and place, their distortion of Roman law to give themselves almost absolute authority at the expense of the people, the knights, and the emperor. Great families like the Hohenzollerns in Brandenburg, the Wettins in Saxony, the Wittelsbachers in the Palatinate, the Dukes of Württemberg, not to speak of the Habsburgs of Austria, behaved like irresponsible sovereigns. If the power of the Catholic emperor over the German princes had been greater, the Reformation might have been defeated or postponed, and the rejection of Rome by many of the princes was a further move toward financial and political independence. The character of the emperors in this period accentuated the weakness of the central government. Frederick III, who ruled from 1440 to 1493, was an astrologer and alchemist, who so loved the studious tranquility of his gardens at Graz that he allowed Schleswig-Holstein, Bohemia, Austria, and Hungary to detach themselves from the empire. But toward the end of his 53-year reign, he played a saving stroke by betrothing his son Maximilian to Mary, heiress to Charles the Bold of Burgundy. When Charles fought himself into an icy grave in 1477, the Habsburgs inherited the Netherlands. Maximilian I, who reigned from 1493 to 1519, emperor-elect but never crowned, began his reign with every omen of success. All the empire rejoiced in his good looks and good nature, his unassuming sensibility, his effervescent cheerfulness, his generosity and chivalry, his courage and skill in joust and hunt. It was as if an Italian of the high Renaissance had mounted a German throne. Even Machiavelli was impressed, calling him a wise, prudent, God-fearing prince, a just ruler, a great general, brave in peril, bearing fatigue like the most hardened soldier, a pattern of many princely virtues. But Max was not a great general, and he lacked the cynical intellect required for Machiavelli's model prince. He dreamed of restoring the grandeur of the Holy Roman Empire by recapturing its former possessions and influence in Italy. He invaded the peninsula time and again in futile wars which the more practical Diet refused to finance. He allowed himself to think of deposing the doughty Julius II and making himself pope as well as emperor. And, like his contemporary Charles VIII of France, he excused his territorial ambitions as necessary preludes to an overwhelming assault upon the Turks. But he was constitutionally and financially incapable of sustained enterprise. He was unable to will the means as well as to wish the ends, and at times he was so poor that he lacked funds to pay for his dinner. He labored to reform the administration of the empire, but he violated his own reforms, and they died with him. He thought too much in terms of the Habsburg power. After many disappointments in war, he returned to his father's policy of diplomatic marriages. So for his son Philip, he accepted Ferdinand's offer of Juana's hand. She was a bit off color mentally, but she brought Spain as her dowry. In 1515, he betrothed his granddaughter Mary and his grandson Ferdinand to Louis and Anne, son and daughter of Ladislas, king of Bohemia and Hungary. Louis was killed at Malhach in 1526. Ferdinand became king of Bohemia, and, so far as the Turks would permit, of Hungary, and the Habsburg power reached its widest range. The most amiable facet of Maximilian was his love and encouragement of music, learning, literature, and art. He applied himself zealously to the study of history, mathematics, and languages. We are assured that he could speak German, Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, Walloon, Flemish, and English, and that on one campaign he talked with 7 alien commanders in their 7 different tongues. Partly through his example and exertions, the dialects of South and North Germany merged into a Gemeines Deutsch, which became the language of German government, of Luther's Bible, and of German literature. Between wars he tried to be an author, and left compositions on heraldry, artillery, architecture, hunting, and his own career. He planned an extensive collection of monumenta, relics and inscriptions from the German past, but again funds ran out. He proposed to the popes a calendar reform, which they effected 80 years later. He reorganized the University of Vienna, established new professorships of law, mathematics, poetry, and rhetoric, and made Vienna for a time the most active seat of learning in Europe. He invited Italian humanists to Vienna and empowered Conradus Celtus to open there an academy of poetry and mathematics. He favored humanists like Peutinger and Pirkheimer and made the harassed Reuchlin a Count Palatine of the Empire. He gave commissions to Peter Vischer, Veit Stoss, Burkmeyer, Dürer, and other artists who flourished in his reign. He ordered at Innsbruck an ornate tomb to cherish his remains. It was left incomplete at his death, but it gave occasion for Peter Vischer's fine statues of Theodoric and Arthur. If Maximilian had been as great as his plans, he would have rivaled Alexander and Charlemagne. In the emperor's last year, Dürer painted an honest portrait of him, worn out and disillusioned, defeated by the maddening stinginess of time. "Earth possesses no joy for me," said this once joyous soul, and he mourned, "Alas, poor land of Germany." But he exaggerated his failure. He left Germany and the empire, if only through economic developments, far stronger than he had found them. Population had risen, education had spread. Vienna was becoming another Florence, and soon his grandson, inheriting half of Western Europe, would become the most powerful ruler in Christendom. 3. The Germans, 1300 to 1517. They were probably at this time the healthiest, strongest, most vital and exuberant people in Europe. As we see them in Wolgemut and Dürer, in Cranach and Holbein, the men were stout, thick-necked, massive-headed, lion-hearted animals ready to consume the world and wash it down with beer. They were coarse but jolly, and tempered their piety with sensuality. They could be cruel, as witnessed the awful instruments of torture that they used on criminals, but they could be merciful and generous, too, and rarely displayed their theological ferocity in physical ways. In Germany, the Inquisition was bravely resisted and usually subdued. Their robust spirits made for bibulous humor rather than dry wit, dulled their sense of logic and beauty, and denied them the grace and subtlety of the French or Italian mind. Their meager Renaissance foundered in bibliolatry, but there was a steady persistence, a disciplined industry, a brute courage in German thought that enabled them to break the power of Rome and already gave promise of making them the greatest scholars in history. By comparison with other nations, they were clean. Bathing was a national passion. Every well-arranged house, even in rural districts, had its bathroom. As in ancient Rome, the numerous public bathhouses provided much more than baths. Men could be shaved there, women could have their hair dressed, diverse forms of massage were offered, drinking and gambling were allowed, and relief could be found from monogamy. Usually the two sexes bathed together, chastely clothed, but there were no laws against flirtations, and an Italian scholar, visiting Baden-Baden in 1417, remarked that no baths in the world are more fit for the fecundity of women. The Germans of that age could not be accused of Puritanism. Their conversation, correspondence, literature, and humor were sometimes coarse by our standards, but that went with their vigor of body and soul. They drank too much at all ages, and imbibed sexual experience lavishly in their youth. Erfurt in 1501 seemed to the pious Luther nothing better than a brothel and beer-house. German rulers, ecclesiastical as well as secular, agreed with St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas that prostitution must be permitted if women are to be safe from seduction or assault. Houses of prostitution were licensed and taxed. We read of the bishops of Strasbourg and Mainz receiving revenues from brothels, and the Bishop of Würzburg gave the municipal brothel to Graf von Hennenberg as a revenue-producing fief. Hospitality to valued guests included placing at their disposal the Frauenhäuser, or houses of women. King Sigismund was honored with this privilege at Bern in 1414 and Ulm in 1434, so heartily to his satisfaction that he publicly thanked his hosts for it. Unlicensed women sometimes set up Winkelhäuser, irregular houses. In 1492, the licensed prostitutes of Nuremberg complained to the burgomaster of this unfair competition. In 1508, they received permission to storm the Winkelhaus. They did. In the actual moral code of Europe in the later Middle Ages, resort to a prostitute was condoned as a venial but normal sin. Perhaps the spread of syphilis after 1492 made it a mortal affair. Marriage, as elsewhere, was a union of properties. Love was considered a normal result, not a reasonable cause of marriage. Betrothal was as binding as matrimony. Weddings were ceremonious and luxurious in all classes. Festivities might last for a week or two. The purchase of a husband was as expensive as the upkeep of a wife. The authority of the male was theoretically absolute, but was more real in deeds than in words. We note that Frau Dürer had much to say to her husband. The women of Nuremberg were undaunted enough to pull the half-naked Emperor Maximilian from bed, throw a wrap around him, and lead him in a merry nocturnal dance in the street. According to a hoary legend, some men of the upper classes in 14th century Germany, when leaving for extended absences from home, locked an iron chastity belt around the waist and thighs of their wives and took the key with them. Traces of the custom are found in medieval Venice and 16th century France, but in the rare cases that seem authentic, the belt was voluntarily donned by wife or mistress, and the key was given to husband or lover as a guarantee of fidelity in marriage or sin. Family life flourished. An Erfurt chronicle reckons 8 or 10 offspring per couple as normal. Households of 15 children were not uncommon. These numbers included bastards, for illegitimate children who abounded were usually taken into the father's home after his marriage. Family names came into use in the 15th century, often indicating ancestral occupation or place of origin, but now and then congealing a moment's jest into the rigor of time. Discipline was firm at home and school. Even the future Emperor Max received many a spanking, and no harm seems to have come from it except to parent or teacher. German homes were now, circa 1500, the most comfortable in Europe, with wide staircases, sturdy balustrades, massive furniture, cushioned seats, carved chests, windows of colored glass, canopied beds, tapestried walls, carpeted floors, bulging stoves, shelves crowded with books or flowers or musical instruments or silver plate, and kitchens gleaming with all the utensils for a German feast. Externally, the houses were mostly of wood, and fires were frequent. Overhanging eaves and windowed balconies shaded the streets. Only a few avenues in the larger towns were paved. Street lighting was unknown except on festival evenings. Life was unsafe outdoors at night. Petty criminals were as numerous as the pigs and cows that strayed in the street. There was no organized police. Severe punishments were relied upon to deter crime. The penalty for robbery was death, or in mild theft, cutting off the ears. Blasphemers had their tongues torn out. Exiles illegally returning to Nuremberg had their eyes gouged out. Women who had murdered their husbands were buried alive or were tortured with red-hot tongs and then hanged. Among the mechanisms of torture formerly exhibited in the Schloss or castle of Nuremberg were chests filled with sharp stones against which the victim was crushed, racks for stretching his limbs, braziers to apply fire to the soles of his feet, sharp iron frames to dissuade him from sitting, lying, or sleeping, and die verfluchte Jungfer, or cursed maiden of iron, who received the condemned with arms of steel, enclosed him in a spiked embrace, and then, relaxing, let him fall, pierced and bloody and broken, to a slow death in a pit of revolving knives and pointed bars. Political morality accorded with the general moral laxity. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.